The lecture hall of the Coalition Space Academy had never been quiet for this long, and it was about to get much quieter. Professor Orvin Tesk, a silver-scale Kalurian with 3 doctorates in xenobiology and 40 standard years of field research, stood before a holographic display that rotated slowly above the lectern. On it spun a planet wrapped in swirling white clouds, its surface a chaotic patchwork of blue oceans, jagged mountains, and storm systems large enough to swallow a moon. Class 4 Death World, she announced, her voice carrying the practiced weight of someone who had said the phrase 1,000 times before. Gravitational instability, extreme thermal variance, uncontrolled predator biomass, atmospheric toxicity spikes, seismic activity in the top percentile of the catalog galaxy. She tapped the console, and a red overlay bathed the planet in warning color. According to the Unified Survivability Index, compiled over 4 decades by the Coalition Biological Research Consortium, the theoretical survival rate for any known sentient species on a world of this classification is 0.003%. Over a full standard year, assuming full technological support. Without support, it rounds to 0. 200 cadets from 40 different species took notes without looking up. This was orthodoxy. Class 4 worlds were where the Coalition sent unmanned probes, not people. As the textbooks put it, the boundary between hostile and homicidal. Are there questions? Professor Orvin asked, more out of habit than expectation. A hand rose in the back row. It wasn't dramatic. It simply rose, calm and unhurried, attached to a young man with dark hair and quiet eyes who had said almost nothing in 3 months of class. Cadet Elon Marsh. Human, one of only a handful of his species at the Academy, and by far the least talkative. Professor Orvin blinked her inner eyelids, mildly surprised. Cadet Marsh. He lowered his hand halfway, as if he weren't entirely sure he should be speaking at all. Then he asked a question that would end up rewriting 4 decades of accepted science. Then explain me. For a moment, nobody moved. A Threxian cadet in the second row turned around in her seat, mandibles clicking in confusion. Professor Orvin's translator hummed faintly as it processed a phrase, checking for idiom, for error, for anything that would make it fit the framework she just spent 20 minutes building. I'm sorry, she said slowly. Explain you how? Elon didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward with the eager hostility of a cadet trying to score a point against a professor. He simply spoke the way he always spoke, like a man reading a weather report. You said the theoretical survival rate for a coalition species on a Class 4 death world is 0. Without support, it rounds to 0. He paused. I was born on one. I lived on one for 18 years before I ever left the surface. No suit, no dome, no life support beyond a roof and some blankets in winter. The room, which had been merely quiet, became something closer to a vacuum. Earth, Professor Orvin said, something new in her voice, not disbelief, but the unsteadiness of scientists meeting a data point that shouldn't exist. Earth is your home world. Yes, Professor. Earth was surveyed 11 years ago. I read the report myself. She pulled it up on the console, claws moving fast. Seismic activity, extreme. Atmospheric oxygen, unstable across geological eras. Apex predator biomass uncontrolled. Diverse, aggressive. Weather systems capable of leveling settlements with no technological intervention. Gravitational and thermal variance exceeding safety thresholds for every known coalition species by a factor of... She stopped. She had read this classification 100 times. She had never once connected it to the quiet cadet in her third-year seminar. Earth is cataloged as a Class 4 death world. She finished very quietly. It has been for over a decade. A ripple went through the room. Cadets glancing at each other, at Elon, at the professor, waiting for the correction that would surely come. There must be enclosed habitats, said a Threxian cadet near the front, not unkindly. Domes, underground cities. Humans engineer their way around the danger the way any species would. Elon shook his head, calm, without a trace of triumph. Most of human history, we didn't have any of that. My grandmother grew up in a farmhouse with no climate control, through 60-degree seasonal swings. My great-great-grandfather crossed an ocean in a wooden boat with no rescue beacon. Billions of humans have lived and died on that surface with nothing between them and the environment but skin, cloth, and stubbornness. That's not survival, someone muttered from the third row. A Varanasi cadet with pale blue skin and an expression of open skepticism. That's population loss. Attrition. How many humans died before you built your enclosed habitats? A lot, Elon said simply. We don't hide that. But the ones who survived kept having children, and their children kept living there too. Not because we're indestructible, because we're the kind of animal that Earth makes. If Earth is the kind of place that makes animals at all. Professor Orvin set down her data slate. For the first time in the lecture, she wasn't looking at her notes. Say that again, she said. The kind of animal Earth makes, Elon repeated. Professor, I think the indexes are wrong about the planet. It's wrong about the assumption underneath it. It measures whether coalition biology that evolved on stable, moderate worlds and only later adapted outward, can survive in a hostile environment it wasn't built for. That's a real number, and it's probably an accurate one. 0% more or less for a species like a Kalurian or a Threxian dropped onto Earth's surface with nothing. He glanced around the room, not with defiance, but with something almost like an apology for what he was about to say. But humans didn't get dropped onto Earth. We were made by it. Every dangerous thing about that planet, the gravity, the weather, the predators, the unstable atmosphere across geological time, is the exact set of pressures that produce the human nervous system, the human immune system, human bone density, human threat response. You're not looking at a species that beat the odds on a death world. You're looking at what a death world builds. If you give it 4 billion years. The lecture hall had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it. Professor Orvin stared at the rotating hologram of Earth, its storms and oceans and jagged red flag terrain, suddenly looking less like a warning label and more like a question she had never thought to ask in 40 years of research. The index doesn't have a category for that, she said, almost to herself. No, Professor, Elon said quietly. I don't think it does. Not yet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she turned to her console and began to type. Not lecture notes this time, but a formal request addressed to the Coalition Biological Research Consortium, flagged urgent. Subject: immediate review required. Unified Survivability Index, Class 4 Death World Classification. Species Homo sapiens. Nobody in that classroom yet understood how far that single message would travel. But something had shifted quietly and permanently in the space of one calm sentence, and the galaxy's oldest scientific certainty about survival had just met its first real exception. The message left Professor Orvin's console in less than a second. The consequences took longer, but when they arrived like a landslide. By morning, the request had been read by 3 department heads, forwarded to Consortium Central Archive, and quietly copied to a member of the Coalition Science Council. None had responded yet. All, per the read receipts, had opened it more than once. Elon Marsh, for his part, showed up to a second-year xenobiology seminar exactly on time, sat in his usual seat, and said nothing about it. He hadn't meant to start anything. He had answered a question honestly, the way his mother had taught him to answer questions, and now half the department seemed to be tiptoeing around him like he was a live reactor core. You could have warned someone, said Cadet Prudal, a Varanasi engineering student and one of Elon's few real friends of the academy, dropping into a seat beside him, mandible clicks of amusement barely suppressed. You crashed 40 years of orthodoxy and then just went to breakfast. I had a test today, Elon said. Breakfast seemed important. It was Professor Orvin herself who found him at lunch, moving through the crowded refectory with a brisk, focused stride of someone who had spent the entire night reading. She didn't sit. She simply stopped at the edge of his table, data slate in hand, and said, Cadet Marsh, the consortium want a formal hearing. They want a survivability reassessment for Homo sapiens, and they want you present as a testifying subject. Prue nearly choked on her food. That's, Professor, that's a Tier 2 research hearing. Those don't happen for undergraduate cadets. Those don't happen for anyone who isn't a department head. They don't happen for a species that appears to falsify a 40-year index either, Orvin said, not unkindly. And yet here we are. She turned back to Elon. I need you to understand something, cadet. This isn't a formality. There are people on that committee who built their careers on a Unified Survivability Index. Dr. Fem Castrali wrote the seismic tolerance models in the original 2XXX edition. Counselor Vroyoff cited the index in the founding charter for the Coalition Frontier Safety Act, the law that keeps colonists off class 4 worlds entirely. If your claim holds up, it doesn't just correct a footnote. It challenges the reasoning behind coalition-wide settlement law. Elon set down his fork slowly. I didn't mean to challenge a law, Professor. I just answered your question. I know, she said. That's what makes us dangerous. You're not trying to win an argument. You're just telling the truth. And the truth happens to be inconvenient for a great many important people. She held his gaze for a long moment. Some of them are going to come after your credibility instead of your data. Be ready for that. She was right sooner than either of them expected. 2 days later, in a session meant to outline what evidence the hearing would require, a Kalurian researcher named Dr. Fem Castrali arrived early, uninvited, and clearly displeased, an older scholar, gray-scaled and precise, with the impatience of a man who'd spent 4 decades being right. Let's be clear what's actually being suggested here, Castrali said, before Orvin had even finished her opening remarks. Turn to Elon with the flat look of someone examining a specimen. You'd have this committee believe an entire sentient species, 11 billion of them, casually thrives under conditions that kill every other known form of complex life within hours. Forgive my skepticism, cadet, but claims of this magnitude are usually exaggeration, misunderstanding, or a survey performed incorrectly. I'm not asking you to believe me, Elon said evenly. I'm asking you to look at the data your own consortium already collected. The Earth survey from 11 years ago is in your archive. Nobody's exaggerating anything. Your own instruments recorded the storms, the gravity, the seismic activity, the biomass. All I did was point out that 11 billion of us are still walking around underneath it. Survey data can be misclassified, Castrali snapped. Perhaps your planet was miscategorized. Perhaps it belongs in Class 3, not Class 4, and this entire episode is built on a clerical error rather than a scientific revolution. It was, Orvin realized with cold, sinking clarity, a very good escape hatch. If it worked, reclassify the planet instead of the species, and the entire Unified Survivability Index would remain untouched. Humanity would simply become an unremarkable case, a species that lived on a moderately dangerous world. Nothing more. She watched Elon consider the accusation. He didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He reached instead for the data slate in front of him, pulled up the original survey, the one Castrali himself had apparently not reread closely in years, and turned around so the older scientist could see it directly. Page 14, Elon said quietly. Your own survey team's seismic instruments recorded 73 tectonic events above magnitude 7 in the 12-month observation window, across 3 separate monitoring stations. Page 22, seasonal thermal variance exceeding 90 degrees between hemispheres, sometimes 60 degrees in a single region within 1 calendar year. Page 31, the biomass table. Your own xenobiologist counted over 400 documented species on Earth capable of killing an unarmed coalition standard humanoid in under a minute. And that's before counting the ocean, which your team only partially surveyed because, and I'm quoting your own report here, the pressure and predator density beyond 200 meters depth presented unacceptable risk to survey personnel. He set the slate down. This isn't a clerical error, Dr. Castrali. Your team wrote Class 4 because Earth earned Class 4 by your own methodology, using your own instruments. You didn't miscategorize the planet. You just never imagined a species that could survive it without help, because in your entire catalog history, there wasn't one. The room was quiet again, that same particular silence from the lecture hall 2 days earlier, except this time belonged to a scientist 40 years into his career, rather than 200 cadets taking notes. Castrali stared at the numbers, his own numbers, for a long moment. Then, stiffly, without quite meeting anyone's eyes, he said, "The hearing will proceed as scheduled." He gathered his slate and left without another word, and Professor Orvin let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That, she said quietly to Elon, was either the easiest part of this process, or the very beginning of the hard part? I genuinely don't know which yet. Elon looked back down at the survey data, his planet, rendered in red warning colors, exactly as dangerous as it had always been, and exactly as home as it had always been too. Either way, he said, the numbers aren't going to change just because people don't like them. Outside the window, the twin suns of the Academy's home system were setting, and somewhere in the Consortium's archive, a 40-year-old index sat waiting for a hearing that would determine whether it survived the week. The Tier 2 hearing chamber was designed for authority, not comfort. A circular room ringed by tiered seating, a single podium at the center, lighting calibrated to make every face visible to every camera. 17 species sat on that panel by charter tradition, the oldest and most established in the coalition. Not one was human. Elon had never felt smaller in his life, and he'd grown up on a Class 4 death world. Professor Orvin sat beside him at the small witness table, her presentation slate glowing faintly in the dim light. Remember, she murmured as the panel took their seats, you don't need to win every exchange. You only need the data to survive contact. Let it speak. Counselor Vrai Off, the Varanasi lawmaker Orvin had mentioned days earlier, opened proceedings with the calm precision of someone who'd done this many times before. She was the author of the Coalition Frontier Safety Act, and everyone understood, unspoken, exactly what was actually on trial. We are here, Off said, to evaluate a formal challenge to Unified Survivability Index as it pertains to Class 4 environments. I want to be direct with everyone present, including our two guests. She glanced toward Elon and Orvin. The index is not merely an academic document. It is a scientific foundation beneath the Frontier Safety Act, which prohibits unsupported settlement on any world classified Class 4 or above. That law has prevented an estimated 600 colonial deaths across 11 coalition species in the 4 decades since its passage. If this committee amends the index without extraordinary care, we do not merely correct a footnote. We potentially reopen worlds that killed people for exactly the reasons the index describes. It was a genuinely fair point, delivered without malice, more dangerous than Castrali's earlier hostility. Off wasn't protecting her ego. She was protecting people who weren't in the room. Cadet Marsh, Off continued, turned to him directly. I want to ask you something plainly, and I'd like a plain answer. Are you asking this committee to declare that any coalition species could settle a Class 4 world safely, the way humans apparently have? No, Elon said immediately. That's not what I'm asking, and I think that's actually the whole point. Explain, Off said. Elon stood, glancing briefly at Orvin, who gave him a small nod. He wasn't used to speaking in front of rooms like this. His voice was quieter than the acoustics of the chamber really wanted, but it held steady. The Unified Survivability Index measures one thing very well, he said. It measures whether a species that evolved somewhere else, somewhere stable, somewhere moderate, can survive being placed into a hostile environment it wasn't built for. For every species in this room, that number is genuinely close to zero on a world like Earth. I'm not disputing that. I've read the index. It's careful work. He let that land for a moment before continuing. But the index has a hidden assumption baked into its methodology, and it's been there so long that I don't think anyone questioned it. Because until 3 days ago, nobody had a reason to. It assumes survivability is a property of the planet. It's not. It's a property of the relationship between the planet and the organisms standing on it. A species that evolved under Class 4 conditions for 4 billion years isn't surviving a death world the way a Colorian colonist would try to survive one, with domes and suits and imported supplies. It's just living somewhere normal. To us, gravity variance and severe weather and dangerous animals aren't obstacles to overcome. They're Tuesday. A ripple of something, not quite laughter, not quite disbelief, moved through the tiered seating. I'm not asking you to open Class 4 worlds of coalition settlement, Elon said. That would still kill people, exactly the way Counselor Oth described, and exactly the way your law is designed to prevent. I'm asking the committee to recognize that the index, as written, doesn't have a category for a species that is native to the hostile environment in question. It only has a category for species that are visiting it. Those are 2 completely different biological situations, and right now the index treats them as if they're the same. It was Dr. Castrali, unexpectedly, who spoke next. He rose slowly from his seat on the panel, and for a moment Orvin tensed, bracing for a second round of the hostility he'd shown days earlier. Instead, he set a data slate down on the rail in front of him, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before. I spent this week reviewing the Earth survey data myself, in full, rather than relying on my memory of it, he said. I want to say, for the record, that Cadet Marsh's characterization of the survey is accurate. I checked the seismic figures. I checked the biomass counts. I checked the thermal variance data, and I cross-referenced it against 3 other Class 4 worlds in our catalog, none of which support any known form of complex sentient life whatsoever. He paused. I built the seismic tolerance models in the original edition of this index. I did so believing they described a universal biological limit. I have spent 40 years teaching them as a universal biological limit. I was wrong, not about the data, but about the word universal. The chamber went very still. The cadet is correct, Castrali continued. Our methodology measures adaptability under duress. It has never once measured a species that is native to the duress itself, because until this survey, we had never encountered one in a form we recognized as sentient. I move that the committee formally acknowledge a new classification category, not an amendment of Class 4 designation, which should remain exactly as strict as it is for the sake of every non-native species Councilroth is rightly trying to protect, but a supplementary designation for species of confirmed native origin on hostile classified worlds. Call it whatever the committee likes. But it needs to exist because as of this hearing, we know for certain that it describes at least one real species, and I suspect, uncomfortably, that it may describe more than one. Counselor Roth studied him for a long moment, then looked to Elon, and then, finally, to the rotating hologram of Earth still spinning quietly above the central podium. The same storms, the same red warning colors, the same planet that had built, by every measure available to coalition science, something none of their models had ever predicted. Motion noted, she said slowly, this committee will reconvene in 3 days to draft formal language. Cadet Marsh, Dr. Castrali, thank you both for what has been, without question, the most consequential 3 hours this panel has spent in a very long time. As the chamber began to empty, Orvin leaned toward Elon, her voice low. You understand what just happened, don't you? 40 years of foundational xenobiology just admitted, on the record, that it was incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. That's rarer and it's bigger. Elon looked at the fading hologram of Earth, still turning slowly above the empty podium. It was always going to survive the review, he said quietly. The planet's been doing that for 4 billion years. I just had to get the room to look at it properly. Neither of them yet knew that the real test of the new classification wasn't going to happen in a hearing room at all. It was going to happen 3 weeks later on a coalition research vessel in deep space, when something went catastrophically wrong. 3 weeks after the hearing, the coalition survey vessel Wandering Current was 3 days into a routine mapping expedition around an uncatalogued moon when its hull breached in 4 places at once, and everything Elon Marsh had said in that chamber stopped being theoretical. Elon wasn't supposed to be aboard at all. He'd been assigned as part of a small rotating group of Academy cadets, completing a field observation credit, the kind of assignment usually reserved for uneventful data logging and long, boring shifts. Professor Orvin had volunteered to supervise personally, partly out of academic interest, partly, she admitted to herself, because she hadn't wanted to let the cadet who'd rewritten her life's work out of her sight quite yet. Neither of them expected the moon's unstable subsurface ice sheet to fracture beneath the ship's anchor points during a routine survey descent. The alarms didn't build gradually. They arrived all at once, a shrieking, overlapping chorus of hull warnings as 4 separate sections of the Wandering Current lost pressure within 11 seconds of each other. Emergency bulkheads slammed down, sealing off 2 full decks, including the lower cargo bay where a 6-person survey team had been prepping equipment for the next day's descent. Report! Barked Captain Yeslin Doe, a Threxian veteran with 20 years of deep space service, as the bridge crew scrambled. Hull breach, decks 3 and 4 multiple points. The ship's engineer called back, voice tight. Ice sheet fracture beneath the anchor field took out our lower stabilizers and tore straight through the outer plating. Decks 3 and 4 are venting atmosphere. Emergency seals engage, but she checked her console, and her mandibles clicked an alarm. Captain, the seal on Cargo Bay 2 didn't fully close. There's a gap. Atmosphere's still bleeding out down there. Who's in Cargo Bay 2? The answer came back a half-second later, and the bridge went cold. 6 names, including Cadet Prudal. Environmental readings from a compromised bay were already scrolling across the main display. Temperature dropping fast as heat vented into vacuum, atmospheric pressure collapsing toward zero, breathable oxygen falling below survivable thresholds for every species aboard. The automated systems gave the trapped crew an estimated 90 seconds before hypoxia became fatal, and the nearest rescue-suited response team was 4 minutes away, still scrambling into gear on the deck above. Elon was already moving before he'd consciously decided to move. "There's a maintenance shaft," he said, grabbing the nearest structural schematic off a wall displayed as Orvin turned toward him in alarm. "It runs from the observation deck down past Cargo Bay 2. I saw on the tour on our first day. It's not sealed by the emergency bulkheads because it's not rated as a crew corridor. If I go down it now, I can reach the bay's manual seal override before the response team gets their suits on." "Cadet, that shaft isn't pressurized past the 3rd junction," the engineer said sharply, not even looking up from her console. "You'd be exposed to near vacuum and freezing temperatures for at least 90 seconds unsuited. That's not a rescue plan. That's a second casualty." "For a Kalurian, maybe," Elon said. He was already at the maintenance hatch, prying the access panel loose with his bare hands. "I don't have gills or a pressure-sensitive membrane. I've got skin, and skin can survive a lot more than people around here seem to think." Captain Doe spun toward him, torn between protocol and the plummeting numbers on her console. 90 seconds unsuited in that shaft will drop your core body temperature into hypothermic range and starve your blood of oxygen. You will lose consciousness. "Maybe," Elon said, "but I'll have 90 seconds of useful movement before that happens. And your suited response team has 4 minutes before they're even in the corridor. Priu doesn't have 4 minutes." He looked at Orvin, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something urgent in his face instead of his usual quiet calm. "Professor, you know the numbers better than anyone in this ship. Tell the captain what a human body can actually survive." Orvin's mind flashed back to the hearing chamber, to Castrali's own words, spoken on the record 3 weeks earlier. A species of confirmed native origin on hostile classified worlds. She had reviewed Elon's physiological baseline data as part of her own follow-up research. Since the hearing, she knew, with more precision than anyone else on that bridge, exactly what she was looking at. "Human cold shock response is measured in minutes, not seconds," she said quickly, turning to Captain Doe. "Their circulatory system prioritizes core organs under thermal stress through a reflex they call vasoconstriction. It buys them time most species simply don't have. Free divers among his species have voluntarily held their breath in cold water for over 4 minutes using techniques any of them can learn. 90 seconds of unsuited exposure is well within survivable range for him, Captain. It would kill any of us. It won't kill him." Captain Doe stared at Elon for exactly 1 second, long enough to make a decision that would have been impossible to justify by any protocol written before that hearing 3 weeks earlier. "Go," she said. "Comms open the whole way down. The second you hit that override, get yourself to the nearest sealed section. Do you understand me? That's an order, not a request." Elon didn't answer. He was already gone, dropping into the dark maintenance shaft as the hatch sealed above him, and the bridge crew watched the shaft's internal temperature readout begin its rapid, terrible fall. 30 seconds, then 50, then 70, while 6 trapped crew members 2 decks below counted down a very different and far more personal kind of clock. The maintenance shaft was already colder than anything Elon had ever felt on Earth, and it was getting worse with every meter he descended. His breath fogged and vanished into thinning air almost instantly. His fingers, gripping the rungs of the emergency ladder, had gone numb somewhere around the 2nd junction, and he could feel his own heartbeat slowing in a way that should have terrified him more than it did. His body doing exactly what Professor Orvin had described on the bridge above, shutting down blood flow to his extremities and hoarding warmth and oxygen for his heart and brain. An ancient reflex written into human biology by an ancient, hostile planet that had never once made survival. Easy. This is just cold water, he told himself, forcing his hands to keep moving. This is a lake in November. This is nothing new. He reached the manual seal override for Cargo Bay 2 with the shaft internal temperature reading well below freezing. His vision began to narrow at the edges in a way he recognized distantly as the early stage of hypoxia. His fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled twice against the release mechanism before finally closing around it. Through the small viewport in the shaft wall, he could see them, 6 figures in the cargo bay beyond, most of them slumped against equipment racks, conserving what little oxygen remained. Priyu was among the last still moving, one hand pressed weakly against the emergency comm panel, her mandibles barely twitching. He pulled the override lever with the last real strength his numbing hands could manage. The bay's damaged outer seal, which had been venting atmosphere in a slow, lethal leak for nearly 90 seconds, ground shut with a groan of overtaxed metal. Pressure alarms on both sides of the wall shifted tone almost immediately, from the shrieking climb of a losing battle to the lower, steadier hum of a system stabilizing. Elon didn't see the rest. His vision had gone fully dark by the time the response team, suited and sprinting, finally reached a junction where he collapsed against a ladder, unconscious but breathing, his skin dangerously cold but his pulse, faint and slow, still there. He woke 12 hours later under a thermal blanket in the ship's medical bay, with Professor Orvin asleep in a chair beside his bed, and Priyu sitting on the edge of the next bunk over, very obviously having refused to leave. "You," Priyu said, the moment his eyes opened, in a voice that wavered somewhere between relief and fury, "are the single most reckless person I have ever met, and I am a Varanasi demolitions cadet who once tried to disarm a training charge of his teeth to win a bet. Is everyone in the cargo bay okay?" Elon's voice came out cracked and dry. "Everyone in the cargo bay is fine," Priyu said, some of the anger draining out her voice. "Because you climbed down an unpressurized maintenance shaft in near vacuum and freezing cold with nothing but your own skin between you and space, on the recommendation of physiology model that, 3 weeks ago, didn't officially exist." She shook her head slowly. "The ship's medical officer ran your vitals through the recovery cycle 6 times because she didn't believe the readings the first 5. Core temperature drop that should cause irreversible organ damage in most species. You've got some frostbite on your fingers, and you'll probably feel like you got hit by a shuttle for a few days. That's it. That's the whole cost." Professor Orvin stirred awake at the sound of voices, and for a moment she simply looked at Elon, really looked at him, with an expression that had nothing to do with data or hearings or academic vindication. "You frightened me badly, cadet," she said quietly. "I want you to know that before anything else. I don't care what the physiology models say. Watching you go down that shaft was one of the worst things I've experienced in 40 years of research." "I know," Elon said. "I'm sorry, Professor. I didn't have time to explain it properly on the bridge. I just knew the numbers, and I knew Priyu didn't have for minutes." Orvin reached over and, in a gesture that surprised them both, rested a clawed hand briefly on his uninjured shoulder. "The numbers were correct," she said. "Captain Doe has already filed an official incident report, and she specifically requested that it be cross-referenced with the consortium's supplementary classification review. She used a phrase I intend to remember for a very long time. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. She wrote, "Cadet Marsh's survival margin in this incident cannot be explained by training, equipment, or luck. It appears to be a baseline biological capability of a species, consistent with recent testimony before the Coalition Science Council. Recommend immediate expansion of emergency protocol training to account for species-specific physiological tolerances previously unrecognized by Coalition safety doctrine." Priyu let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Do you understand what that means? An official Coalition incident report just cited your hearing testimony as operational precedent. That's not a classroom argument anymore. That's law adjacent. That's the kind of document that ends up rewriting emergency training manuals across the entire fleet." Elon closed his eyes, exhaustion and the last traces of the cold finally catching up with him all at once. Outside the medical bay's small viewport, the moon that had nearly killed 6 of his crewmates hung in silent, indifferent space, exactly as hostile as it had been 3 weeks ago, exactly as hostile as it would be tomorrow. "I didn't do it to prove a point," he murmured, half asleep already. "I did it because Prue needed 90 seconds, and I was the only one who had them to spare." "I know," Orvin said softly, watching him drift off. "But sometimes the truest proof of a theory isn't the one you go looking for. It's the one that finds you in a moment when there's no time left to argue about it." She sat with him a while longer, the hum of the recovering ship steady around them, and thought, not for the first time since that lecture 3 weeks ago, about how very little of the galaxy's oldest science had ever accounted for a planet that built people like this. 6 months after a quiet cadet raised his hand in a lecture hall and asked the professor to explain him, the Coalition Biological Research Consortium published the most significant revision to the Unified Survivability Index in its 40-year history. And this time, nobody in the galaxy could pretend it didn't matter. The document was long, dense, and written in the careful, hedge-everything language of institutional science. But buried in its introduction was a sentence that Professor Orvin Tesk had personally insisted on including, word for word, over the objections of 2 committee members who thought it was too editorial for a formal index. This revision exists because a single testifying subject demonstrated, through both documented physiology and a subsequent verified field incident, that survivability is not a fixed property of a planet, but a relationship between a planet and the organism shaped by it. The consortium acknowledges that its prior methodology, while rigorous within its original scope, failed to anticipate the existence of native origin species on hostile classified worlds. It should have. The supplementary classification Dr. Castrali had proposed in the hearing chamber was formally adopted under the designation endemic hostile origin species, quickly shortened, in the informal way these things always are, to simply HO status. Homo sapiens became the first confirmed entry in Coalition history, but not, as Elon had quietly predicted months earlier, the last. Within a year, consortium researchers reopened dozens of old planetary surveys with a new framework in mind, and found 2 more candidate species on worlds previously written off as uninhabitable, one a colony of aquatic organisms thriving in the crushing, toxic depths of a gas giant's moon, the other a small population of insectal sentients who had, entirely unnoticed by prior surveys, been living for generations in the radioactive highlands of a world nobody had ever bothered to survey. Twice, the galaxy's oldest scientific certainty, that survival had one shape and life beyond it simply ended, had quietly, permanently become more complicated and more honest. Word of a hearing, and later the incident aboard the Wandering Current, spread to the Coalition in a particular way that stories do when they're strange enough to repeat at dinner tables across 100 worlds. Humans, who had joined Coalition only 2 decades earlier and had mostly been regarded with a kind of polite, distant curiosity, found themselves the subject of an entirely new conversation. It wasn't always a comfortable one. Some species reacted with open unease at the idea of a race that had evolved under conditions capable of killing almost anything else. The old instinct to fear what one doesn't fully understand didn't disappear just because a committee updated an index. But far more often, across mess halls and diplomatic receptions and academy classrooms not unlike the one where this had all begun, the reaction settled into something closer to respect, tinged with a wary, genuine fascination. They don't survive death worlds, people have begun to say, half in admiration and half in disbelief, in 100 different languages across 100 different systems. They come from them. Elon Marsh, for his part, found the sudden attention almost unbearably strange. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of anything. He'd answer a question honestly in a lecture hall, and then climb down a maintenance shaft because his friend needed 90 seconds nobody else could spare. Both of those things made sense to him individually. The galaxy-spanning conversation they had somehow triggered together did not. He returned to the academy for his final year largely unchanged, quieter than most of his classmates, still inclined to answer questions with fewer words than the situation seemed to call for, still uncomfortable when strangers recognized his name in hallways. He'd walked in anonymity for 2 years. But Professor Orvin's classroom had changed considerably. The rotating hologram of Earth still spun above the lectern on the first day of the new term, but the red warning overlay that had once framed it as pure hazard now shared the display with a second, smaller graphic. The EHO classification symbol, quietly appended beside the old Class 4 designation, a small addition that represented an enormous shift in how an entire species understood the concept of danger. Class 4 Death World. Professor Orvin told her new cadets, in the same steady voice she'd used at the start of the term 2 years earlier, remains among the most hostile environmental classifications in the Coalition catalog. Gravitational instability, extreme thermal variance, uncontrolled predator biomass. She paused, and for the first time in 40 years of teaching this material, she allowed herself something like a smile. And, as of 18 months ago, we now know that hostile is not the same as impossible. It simply depends on what you're asking a world to build. In the back row, half hidden as always, Elon Marsh said nothing and took no notes, because he already knew the ending to this particular story better than anyone else in the room. But when a new cadet, a nervous young Threxy in her first month at the academy, glanced back at him with the same searching curiosity 100 strangers had shown him over the past year, he offered her something he rarely gave anyone, a small, quiet smile and a faint, private satisfaction of a man who had never meant to change how the galaxy understood survival, and had done it anyway, with nothing more than an honest answer, and the planet that raised him standing quietly behind every word of it. Epilogue. 40 light years away, on a small blue and green world the Coalition catalog still listed. Technically, as Class 4, the storms rolled in exactly as they always had, and the mountains stood exactly as jagged, and somewhere in a farmhouse much like the one Elon's grandmother had grown up in, a new generation of humans was being born into weather and gravity and danger that the rest of the galaxy had only recently learned to call, with something between fear and admiration, simply home.